Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. You're here to talk about your book, Remember Liss.
My book and the person Liss.
Yeah, because, my whole thesis is everything's a primary source. Mm-hmm. I've even extended that to being people are primary sources of the time and place that they live, that had they lived in another time. What compelled you to write the story of her? What was your main attraction?
Almost 20 years ago now, I literally stumbled upon primary documents that began to tell her story, a series of letters that I found in a library archive way out on the end of Long Island in East Hampton. What prompted me to find those letters was the discovery of a Bible that had been handed down through generations of a family called Townsend. So this Townsend descendant decided to put this family Bible up for sale. Now, family Bibles usually aren't valuable, but this one had records of enslaved people that had been enslaved by the Townsend family in Oyster Bay during the Revolutionary War period. So there's now a house museum in Oyster Bay that tells the story of the White family, and they bought that Bible, which kind of blew open their story. It was now going to be the story of a white family of 10, and after my research, 20 enslaved black people who also lived there.
Isn't that the power of primary sources? Mm-hmm. And we generate them all the time without realizing it. And something like a family Bible is a pretty traditional pop culture. I mean, that was popular culture of the 18th, the 19th, and even to the 20th century, kind of like cookbooks where you'd keep your family records in there because it was a book you used frequently, so you might as well do that kind of thing. And it's amazing how that kind of thing can be hidden from history, through as time goes on, and then once it's found, it sheds light on an entire story that didn't exist.
It opened up another universe.
Right.
I had been living in Oyster Bay and just sort of connected to this museum, like on the weekends, helping out there. But I certainly had no idea of the extent of slavery on Long Island because it wasn't something that we were being taught. We were being taught that the founding figures were a whole grouping of very wealthy and important white men, and that the story of the founding of America was essentially a white story, and that the story of slavery happened during the Civil War in the South. But as I learned, that was not at all true.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme of kind of isolated groupings of people that... I mean, what we're dealing with here is historiography, really, because it's just how history is told. History itself can be a primary source of its time period, and who is focused on, who is forgotten about, who, from what perspective. I like to fashion what I do as being very ground up, right? It's not ground up like meat, but from the bottom up. So, learning about the people that perhaps are not... I think they're starting, so we keep our voices down. But, thinking about the way that people that might be marginalized or forgotten about in the past because they didn't keep the fancy, traditional primary sources. There's not a whole bunch of letters or...
And what are the reasons why people are remembered? A lot of people will ask me in regards to Liss, did she invent anything? Because somewhere along the way we decided that people should be notable because they invented things.
Right.
No, she didn't invent anything. Oh, was she a political figure? No. Was she famous in her own time? No. But I still say that she is a founding figure, because much like Anne Frank is a figure that allows you to understand the Holocaust, Liss is a figure that allows you to understand what it was like to be a woman of color during the time of America's founding.
Yeah, and almost before those kinds of roles became super defined, she was in that era where it was being defined, like we were saying
before. And interestingly, her story actually interweaves with known narratives. So she is connected to George Washington, to the Culper Spy Ring, to, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and, Benedict Arnold and John Andre. All those figures legitimately weave through her story. Even the Boston Massacre weaves its way in there.
Yeah, and in doing so, I suppose it doesn't refute or deny anything that's ever been written about those figures.
Certainly not.
But it just adds to almost like a cast or, the panorama view.
It really illuminates them and humanizes those other events, like, the Battle of Brooklyn. It gives you a boots-on-the-ground perspective and asks the reader, what would I do?
It also makes you realize that there was a lot more going on than just physical conflict, like battles and stuff.
Yeah.
We get a perspective, and I grew up loving that kind of history. I was all about war stuff, and then there was some point where I'm just like, that's actually, I don't want to say boring, but it really makes it seem like that's all that's happening throughout human life is constant fighting, and that's the only way we benchmark things. I'm like, well, what's going on when the fighting's not? Even if there is a battle going on, what's happening
in the next town over,
or even 200 miles away, and just like what was everyday life like? And so it sounds like she represents that a little bit closer.
She made some very bold choices. She wasn't a person that had history happening to her. She showed a lot of agency. For instance, in the middle of the war, when she was about 17, she escaped from the household where she was enslaved. And that household itself is such an interesting way to anchor the story. It was a wealthy family, these Townsends, and their son had just become Washington's lead spy in Manhattan. So he became known under the spy name Culper Jr. and was the lead of the Culper Spy Ring.
Is this they made that show Turn?
They did.
That, right?
They made that show, and boy, did they mess up that story. They made so many mistakes. It was shocking.
So I was put off mostly by the way Robert Rogers was portrayed, being a New Hampshire figure, and they even mentioned that in one of the episodes. They're like, "Oh, you go back to New Hampshire," and he sounds like Shrek. I mean, they have this Scottish guy, and I realized the accents they're kind of hard to nail down, colonial era accents, but it was just like that.
Well,
if somebody was born and raised in New Hampshire, he wouldn't sound Scottish, probably.
The most atrocious mischaracterization for me wasn't Robert Townsend, who they did get very wrong, but John Graves Simcoe.
Yeah, Simcoe is...
who they made him a villain.
He's weird in that.
And in Liss's true story, he is a hero. He not only personally knew her very well, he helped her escape in May of 1779. He didn't billet ever out in East Hampton. He billeted in the household of the family that enslaved her 3 different times. And so after that first billeting, the overwintering, he helped her escape, and he would go on to help several other black people escape slavery. He is the person who ended slavery in Canada in the mid-1790s.
Yeah, he essentially founded Upper Canada,
founded Toronto.
Right? He was like the aristocrat. Yeah, they really portrayed, and I mean, that's a whole other conversation. My wife, who's a librarian and has degrees in literature, is like, she's like, I want to do a study on the way that British officers are portrayed in media, because
and the American family, the Townsends, liked him. They actually say that he was an honorable man, which is not how he's portrayed. He's portrayed as a psychopath.
Right.
And they later on named a street after him in the town that they gave the land over to, Simcoe Street. They actually, the Victorian next generation, had a hotel called Simcoe House right down the street. So they revered him.
I think what we're touching on is just the way that primary sources have such authority that they're so hard to refute. I mean, you can say, well, this is just one perspective if it's like a manuscript or something like that. But ultimately, it's what's left behind, and it tells a better story. I'm sure that when they made that, because that show came out, I say it like it's an era of years ago. It was just 10 years ago or so, but it came out in a time when, there was like, oh, let's do another perspective on that. Let's show the excitement and the intrigue of that era that's usually considered very stuffy. But they still, in my opinion, took way too much time focusing on the people at the top and not really spending enough time with the ordinary. I think they could have kept Washington out of it altogether. I think that would have been great if they had just made it like see him from a distance kind of thing.
I had an even more personal beef with that show. I had approached Alexander Rose before I wrote my first book called Espionage and Enslavement about Liss. I had approached him to be my co-author because I knew I needed a professional co-author. Yeah. He said no, but by then I had already told him the basis of her story, and he wrote in the character Abigail into the plot. Oh, right. And so Abigail was like Liss light.
I see.
Yeah, so not cool.
I could see that as well, and a lot of the characters in that show, and I don't want to spend too much more talking about Turn, but it seemed like they were just like characters from other Revolutionary War stories that they just kind of plopped in there. Like nobody had the same. The accents drove me nuts. Like nobody had. They're all from Setauket.
It was very Setauket central, which in the Culper Spy Ring was not the case. Abraham Woodhull did start spying before Robert Townsend, but the reason why Setauket was important was because it was so out of the way. Yeah. Manhattan was British headquarters in America. That was where it was important. Right. And so Robert Townsend taking on that role as Culper Jr., he was gathering the important intel and then just taking it way out of the way to Setauket in a way that the British wouldn't have suspected. By going the long way around, which took much longer and made the information less usable, they kept from getting caught. They would have got caught if they would have taken it straight across the river. Right.
It's like the same plot of land that The Great Gatsby takes place on. It's like 200 years later. But going back to your book about Remember Liss, I feel like this is part of over the last decade or so an awakening of sorts.
Very much so.
Because I mentioned before I hit record that being in the seacoast of New Hampshire, we have the Ona Judge is a very similar story. She's Washington's enslaved person who escaped. And
it is similar in that it's connected to this major historical figure, and it gives you this other perspective of what was it like for her. How did she have to show agency to try to get her freedom? But one way that Liss's story is even more interesting is that her initial escape is just part one. That's just one of the interesting things that happened to her. Then she had this whole life during the war where she was interacting with the Culper Spy Ring in the city. And then after the war, she was sold south to Charleston, South Carolina, and enslaved by the man who was the key figure of the Boston Massacre and who appears in the Boston Massacre painting right next to Crispus Attucks. So I feature that on the cover of my book. The man in the famous paintings of the Boston Massacre with the club, that's a man named Richard Palms, and just coincidentally, he enslaved her in Charleston for 2 years. Wow. And learning about his story was fascinating. He was not a kindly old apothecary by any means. He was actually a very interesting man who was quite violent.
Isn't that... And now we can touch on another piece of pop culture, which is the... I don't think that's the one, but the Boston Massacre has inspired many pieces of artwork, including, of course, the Paul Revere made one, which is the Bloody Massacre, and that thing was circulated throughout the colonies after the massacre had taken place and informed a lot of people's opinions in that time of what was happening in Boston and what was kind of the plight of the colonists there. And it's remarkable. I feel that, going back to other forms of media, you have the John Adams miniseries that was based on the book.
Yeah, Richard Palms is featured in that as his personal bodyguard as he and his son went over to France.
Kind of a tough guy, and I had no idea that And again, primary sources highlight that this guy wasn't just, his story isn't just reserved to one moment in 1770. It's goes well beyond. And I suppose that would be another great way. I think when studying history for students in particular, it's wonderful to compare and contrast. So take an Ona Judge and Liss, and kind of, okay, so Ona's saga is well after the war, right? It's when George Washington is president. Liss is during the war, right? So there's a different set of circumstances, different dangers, different opportunities when the British are still very present in the continent compared to afterwards.
But they both showed such bravery and agency in taking that risk. Unfortunately for Liss, after she initially escaped, she was just re-enslaved by the British because they weren't promising freedom in the midst of the war, only at the end. And so then you can learn the whole story of how thousands, over 3,000 African Americans who had been enslaved here, left America and went up to Nova Scotia. And many of them had a tough time up there.
Where do you think your book and all of your work really will show up in the future as primary sources?
Well, what we did with this book was really link all the primary sources that I found in my journey through the New York Archives, through their teaching platform called Consider the Source. So as students and teachers interact with her story, they don't have to take my word for it. They can go and see the primary sources. But of course, it's my wish that more primary sources will bubble up. I mean, just earlier this year, I found another primary source that fleshed out her story even more. Because archives are digitizing things all the time. And as that digitization becomes more accessible, I keep finding stuff. In between the hard copy and the paperback of my adult level book, Espionage and Enslavement, I had to add a chapter because I learned so much more about her between the two editions.
Isn't that remarkable?
Yeah.
And that's what I think 100 years from now, when people are looking and studying this time period, maybe even specifically today, November 5th, 2024, that your work will fall in with others and give, because I had a friend who worked with me on my project saying, it's not enough really it's great to dissect a record or a movie like we do on this show all the time, but that doesn't tell the whole story. You need to line it up with other media. And that's why I'm glad we're talking about those shows and the other books and everything like that. So I think that with yours, 100 years out, 50 years from now, whatever, when somebody's looking back on the 2020s and the 2010s, they'll say, this, especially the design of having the QR codes, having an interactive, very traditional style presentation. It's a book, but incorporating the web, that is ultra early 21st century, isn't it? That's the ultimate.
And the New York Archives site is amazing. They will allow a teacher to establish their own profile for free, and then they can upload their own primary source as a counterpoint to something that I've put up there, and make their own woven lesson plan. It's really enriched.
You're also describing my website. So this podcast, and you may be listening to it right now on everything-history.com, is up for you teachers and anybody else who wants to take part to add your own ideas on. So if you have other stories from around, we just identified two. I could throw Prince Whipple into that mix too. I'm sure you've heard of Prince.
I need to know more about Prince Whipple.
So William Whipple was from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He was the signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a general.
Captain Whipple.
That would be him, I assume.
He's part of the story?
Yeah, he's in the military. He was in the military as well.
Did he captain a naval vessel in the midst of the war?
Maybe. He was from, his house overlooked the port, so it's perfectly reasonable.
We have to talk more about Captain Whipple.
But where Prince joined William Whipple in the conflict, he was enslaved by him. And Prince was also part of a group of enslaved people in Portsmouth who put together a petition for freedom.
My Captain Whipple is a white man.
Oh, yeah, so is William Whipple. So he signed the Declaration of Independence.
I think it's the same person.
It probably is. Whipple's not a very common name, so I always think of the froth on the top of a cappuccino or something as Whipple, but he was a pretty, so it's his house, which is the Moffat Ladd House in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for a long time, it was established by the colonial dames of America,
Yes,
and it was
dames.
for the longest time all about him,
Right.
and his family. And you would go into these stately rooms and learn. Very recently, they've decided to redesign the presentation
great.
so to incorporate and to highlight, and that's consistent with throughout Portsmouth. They have the Black History Trail, which is doing the exact same thing. I used to work at a museum that one of the houses was 1777 tavern, which always had a story. I mean, it's a true story because they leaned a little bit loyalist, the family did, or at least suspected was, on the tavern, of a riot that basically started in the tavern and spilled out into the streets, which resulted in their tavern sign being cut down like a tree.
Wow.
And they had an enslaved man there named James who went out. He was sent out by the family to go stop
right.
the riot.
You stopped the riot.
And he got knocked in the head, knocked out. Awful thing. But it was like, for a long time, the interpretation of that place was about the family, the Stavers family.
Yeah.
But recently, it's been more about James.
I mean, I wish Raynham Hall Museum, which is where Liss was enslaved, would focus even more on her. She's more just like a little side character there now. But to me, the 20 enslaved people are maybe more interesting, well, every bit as interesting as the White Townsend.
Well, you said it so well before. It's all about weaving together this big tapestry. It's not just, I mean, you don't just have one thread, and that's the only thing that you should think about when it comes to the past. It's everybody's involved, and so it provides
If you're really
that
into Whipple, I have a primary document you'd like to see.
So we could do this all day.
yeah.
I mean, this is my thing, is primary
Robert
sources.
Townsend's older brother was a ship's captain, and when he was in Paris, he met with Benjamin Franklin, who gave him an oath of allegiance to America, so he could return to America and prove he was on the Patriot side. This is Culper Jr.'s older brother.
Yeah.
And Colonel Whipple was the captain of the ship that he returned on, and he wrote an affidavit that said, Captain Solomon Townsend was very well behaved on the whole trip back, and he didn't cause any trouble.
That's wild. I love how, these things, and I mean, your work is a testimony to the power of primary sources.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure it, like you said, is a bit of frustration when you're trying to figure, like, oh, I found something else. Now how do I incorporate it?
Oh, well, that's why my nonprofit owns the rights to the student book, because every time we discover something new, I can just put it in there.
Got it.
When I had to deal with Lions Press in my first book, me and my co-author, Tiffany Yecke Brooks, we really had to fight to get that extra chapter in there. And they were restricting the length of it. I would have put more in there that I had discovered, but we kind of had to pick and choose.
I guess that's my last question for you is, because I've talked to other authors who use a lot of primary source work to sculpt their stories. Do you ever find yourself having to make that decision of curating, like not using something, or at least not as heavily as others?
The thing that I figured out this year that was so interesting was that the pair of side-by-side houses where Liss was enslaved right before she was sold south, the year she came back, 1787, that pair of buildings was sold to become the Bank of New York.
What?
Yeah. So the Bank of New York, pretty big in New York there. It was first housed in a private house, and then it was housed for 10 years in this pair of buildings, 11 and 12 Hanover Square. And I found that out because I found the survey, which is owned by the New York Public Library. They digitized it, and there it was, mentioning the bank building. And so it wasn't until after that, till 1797, that it moved to Wall Street, where you see all these plaques and recognitions of that first Bank of New York.
I mean, that's a whole other thing, is banking in America that didn't really exist before.
And when it started there on Hanover Square, was first housed there, there are editorials in the paper about, do we need banks? Maybe rich people do, but what about us regular people? Yeah. And then they had a big splashy ad in the paper I found. We are now offering paper money. Woohoo! Paper money. What a thought.
Did the building look at all like a bank, or just...
It was 2 buildings. One was primarily for the bank, and the other one was for the cashier, who also sold goods out of it. So the bank owned both buildings, but only 11 was used primarily as the bank, and then 12 was for their guy to live in and do his work out of.
So you have like teller windows and...
No, it was a 3-story brick building, and it's very well described. It was brick, which might have been important to people over wood, but it was on a very busy shopping square called Hanover Square, where you can still go.
Yeah.
But it's all skyscrapers there now.
That's
But
pretty
it's
impressive.
right at the foot of Stone Street, which still looks very historic. So when you come up Stone Street, you're just emptied out right into Hanover Square.
This has been so much fun talking to you. We could go on for hours,
could.
really.
Thank you so much, Eric.
But
for
I
having
would
me
say
on the
that
show.
each one of these things, it just is a reminder, walking around, of course, a place like New York City, every building has a story behind it.
I actually do a walking tour about Liss.
There you go. I mean, and you could use each one as, in the design of it, who built it, why they built, all that stuff is just so, there's stories there about the past, and we're so grateful that we have people such as yourself who want to take the time and actually go through it and care about it and allow for, in this case, her story to continue on.
It needs everything. So rememberliss.org is our website. And this isn't about a single book or a person like me. This is about her, and it's about how do we introduce this story and this point of view across America. I actually introduced this into a middle school in Florida last year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it got through all of the committees, and there was a Moms for Liberty person on their school board, so it was tough.
Yeah,
but we got into that 6th grade classroom.
Coming from, well, New Hampshire has its own stuff going on too, but I would, we're the live free or die state, so there's not as much, it wouldn't be as big of a success of getting a book into a New Hampshire school as a Florida one, because Florida has so many barriers
Challenges.
and stuff and everything. But I'm really glad that her story's getting out there. And
it's a story that
Boston?
isn't just about one person or just about Black people. It's really about the whole founding of America. And when teachers are reading this in the classroom, it's really allowing them to teach it side by side with all the other topics that they were already teaching.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. It's not intrusive. You're not asking them to.
There's no taking sides.
Right.
You're really seeing how, if you were living in that moment, what side would you take? Really helping you think about, we're calling the British the bad guys, but what would it have been like if they would have been offering you freedom? Would you have taken them up on that?
Yeah. Oh, that whole era is just so. We get taught, of course, the American perspective on things, because that's where the country came from. But when you look at the British, there was all signs in the world that they were going to allow for if I think another generation had waited it out. We would look a lot like Australia or Canada.
Yeah. You only have to look at Canada to see a great example of that.
What would have changed. But, I love my country, so I'm not going to complain.
I do, too. And I love that all of this turmoil and all of this uncertainty was able to come together and form our country.
And I'm glad that we have things. Cause I have a copy of the book. I've read it, and I like that it reveals in a very straightforward, easy to follow way, and sleek and concise and everything, but it doesn't show, if I'm trying to find the words right, that era as this nice, neat package.
Yeah.
It's the chaos and it's the uncertainty that produces, it's very much Hegelian dialectic. It's eventually the right thing will happen.
And that's how life is, It's a constant work in progress, as we are finding out today on Election Day.
Well, who knows when this will air, but
I don't know.
We'll sound
We're still in the time of not knowing.
Right, which, who knows, might go on for a little while. But
it might.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Eric. It was such a pleasure.
Enjoy the rest of your time. I'll see you in Boston in a few weeks.
We'll see you in Boston, exactly.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Bye. popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything is a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything is a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.